Guys, the last one of our recent videos that we just pushed out was about scope creep, and apparently that triggered some interesting dialogue slash opinion as to what is scope creep, where did it come from, its originations, and do we even know what we're talking about? I mean, it was a fair question, I suppose, given limited context and maybe not seeing the whole picture. But surprisingly, it's kind of a big topic, and I feel like there might be a couple of sides that are being explored here. You got one, people who are professionals and understand the nature of all the things and do project management really well or product development really, really well. And there's other people who are just saying, I'm frustrated with scope creep, and that's the limited expression that they have. But I'm curious, after that brief dialogue and interaction that we've had so far in that original video, what are we all thinking about? What are we missing? I mean, how come this is a hot spot? Any ideas as to why this might have flared up?
I have some thoughts. I mean, yeah, it's an emotional subject, and it perhaps clear definition of what we mean by scope creep is in order. The way I think about scope creep is basically you have a fixed amount of time, and now people are trying to jam more stuff into that fixed amount of time, where you don't have that extra capacity, and so we're adding more and more and more, and it's sort of creeping and it's sort of growing out, and that freaks people out because, hey, wait, hold on, I've got my vacation plan for the day after this launch, and now you just added 50% more stuff to this launch. Hold on, no, I'm not working nights and weekends for the rest of my life to hit that date. Now, Scrum doesn't have a definition for scope creep, of course, because we're flexible and we're allowing for change, but we're also allowing for more of a focus on a goal rather than a fixed amount of things in a small package or a fixed amount of work in a small timeline. Those are my thoughts on why people might get really emotional about this subject, because it's usually been a bad thing. I've never heard of scope creep ever being good.
The context in which I first came across the term scope creep early in my career, I was dealing in a product development scenario where there were very formalized sign-offs up and down the organization, several people for specific milestones. And those milestones were like, I'm going to be generic with the terminology here because we had very specific terminology in the new product introduction process we were following. But you had sign-offs on high-level requirements. You had sign-offs on detailed requirements. You had sign-offs on designs. You had sign-offs on risk mitigation plans, right? And so to go backwards and reopen that Pandora's box of, oh, now we have to re-sign off on this 1,500 page requirements document was a big, slow process. I mean, it was, weeks of arguing about whether or not we should or should not go back a phase and have to redo milestone 2 or, to change the scope. And so, some of my context that, I could probably spend an hour talking about is that in Scrum, you don't have that same sign-off process for phases because every sprint you're producing a deliverable increment. The way I talk about it in class is instead of having phases of requirements and design and build and test, you're peeling a little bit of each of those phases and doing that several times per sprint so that every sprint you have a done increment. And crucially, you're not planning and locking in requirements for future sprints. So you can change on a dime. Is there still change control? I suppose, but at some level, it's become so different in what we're talking about, where it's one is the product owner going, with the product backlog. The other is, great, let's do revision 17 of this 5,000 page document and get 17 sign-offs on it. So to me, those things are very different. Could you call them both change control? I suppose. But at some point, a difference in amount is a difference in kind. And to me, that the two are just very different. And like we said in the previous video, scope creep just isn't a thing in Scrum because there isn't a predefined scope the way there is in the context that I'm describing.
Is it possible that there has been a controlled evaluation of scope, but yet there's still scope creep because the people who are doing the work feel that it's scope creep, even though somebody else did all the analysis and value discovery and said, no, this is 100% right. We're totally doing this with a controlled mental knowledge of here's the risk and the things, and now go do the thing. And so, you have people who are on the doing side who are feeling the creep. They're the ones that are going to, I think, Rob's point, there's no way I'm going to work nights and weekends to be able to get your thing done. You made this promise, not me. Well, who made the promise? The people with all the filters and the ability to make this decision and say it's quantifiable, this is qualifiable, we need to do this thing. It's gone through a change control process, but it really hasn't taken into consideration the actual people who are going to essentially kind of hurt as a result of this evaluation. So therefore, you've got controlled change on one part of the spectrum. And I'm not even referring to Scrum here, right? We could just generically say people might control the change in one part of the system, but on another part of the system, they're experiencing the hurt and the pain of said control mechanism because there wasn't taking into account the actual effort and it wasn't sustainably thought through, and somebody's going to suffer on the backside. Now, what's the consequence of something like that? In my opinion, and I think evidence would show this as well, there's going to be a consequence by way of the quality of what is produced is going to suffer in some way. Either the individuals can't do what they were being asked to do in that amount of time, so shortcuts will be taken. You're going to potentially lose individuals who would otherwise want to work on your product, but given the pattern of this controlled change that influences them and makes it feel like scope creep, they're out. They're going to want to go find a different job in which that doesn't occur. I want to appeal to who's being hurt. There's somebody who's saying, I don't like scope creep. Help. And that's the piece that I think I wanted to elevate here. It's painful, but people who are controlling the things like, no, it's under control. This is controlled change. We've done the due diligence. This has been analyzed. It's worth the risk. Go do the thing. And you have people on the other side saying, no, that's scope creep. It hurts. And you haven't taken into account the people doing the work. Now, that's one example, but evidence, I think, of the frequency that that's been brought up with people saying it hurts. The people in the desk doing the work feel it. It feels like scope creep, even if it was considered control change. Anyway, I think I've repeated myself 6 times over, but
if we're going to be adaptable, which is, a synonym for agility and agile, right? If we're going to be adaptable, we should be willing to embrace new scope if we're doing so in an evidence-based way and a mindset towards value and goals and all the things we talk about in Scrum, right? I've witnessed this argument before. Marketing says, we have a whole bunch of new requirements for you because we just learned something new about our customer and we want to delight our customer. Great. Engineering says, hang on, we've already built some things based on the requirements we agreed on 6 months ago, and if you keep changing the requirements, we'll never get something out the door. And both sides have a valid point, and I witnessed that argument a lot early in my career. But again, going back to what I said before, it's because it was in the context of we have a requirements phase. That phase is defined, it begins, it ends, and it has sign-offs. And if we have to reopen that box, it's a waste of time, and it slows things down, and it delays when we're going to get to market, and all these other bad effects. And to your point, Greg, it can be painful to people because we're now going to spend more time building something that we already built or undoing something we already built and shifting the ground under our feet. And if we're going to be adaptable, we should build up systems that allow us to learn new things about our customer and delight them the way the marketing team was trying to do in my example there, without causing the pain to the people building the product and causing them to work nights and weekends or delay their vacations or whatever. Scrum is one way to do that, where we say we're going to not have a predefined scope. We're going to deliver something of value every single sprint. And so now our decision to release to the market is more of a business decision and not is the technology ready decision. And so that, I think, frames the whole scope discussion differently. It's like we can add scope, we can remove scope, we can change scope. If we're adding scope and we have an inflexible date, something's going to give. Quality is going to give. Our people are going to quit. Our people are going to be burned out. They're going to be working nights and weekends. So something's got to give. If we're in a simple space mindset where we have predetermined scope and we have a predetermined date and we're going to add scope, but we're going to move the date, maybe that's not a problem. If we're in a Scrum or more agile mindset where we're going to add scope and we don't have a predetermined scope and we don't have a predetermined date, maybe that's not a problem. I think the problem comes when we're trying to fix 2 or even all 3 of the corners of that iron triangle of project management, time, scope, and budget. If we're trying to fix all 3 of those, we either have to have really, really high predictability, and in which case you should probably quit your job and go to Vegas, or quality is going to suffer or something else is going to suffer. Hey, thanks for watching that video. Did you like what you heard? If so, you're going to love our Scrum classes. See, not only do we talk about these ideas on YouTube, we're also professional Scrum trainers, and we'd love to have you in one of our classes. So if you need to level up as a Scrum Master or a product owner, maybe you need to learn how to scale Scrum or combine Kanban or UX with Scrum, click the link in our description and you'll find a list of our upcoming classes.
If you like this video, just leave us a comment. And if you got some positive feedback, we'd love to hear it. And if you've got some negative feedback, well, we'd love to hear that too.